I've been reading a lot of comments recently from illustrators, and one thing that has been coming up again and again is that clients and companies just don't care anymore. They don't care about quality, they don't care about the time it has taken for someone to develop their skills. And also, it feels like they don't care about the ethical questions surrounding AI usage. And I think there is some truth to it, but I also think that we may be making the wrong argument, because companies are not the patrons of the artists, of the illustrators. They don't have a responsibility to make sure I continue having a great career as a medical illustrator. And if tomorrow they believe they can achieve the same goal, which is $20 instead of spending $2,000 for an illustration, then I guess it's just logical that a company will explore that option. I mean, we can tell them that human art is better. We can tell them about the years of training that is involved for us. We can talk about copyright, ethics, originality, and everything surrounding generative AI. And some clients will care and others just won't. But there is someone clients, writers, and companies absolutely have to care about, and that is their own customer, their own reader, their consumer. And I think that is where the conversation gets interesting. So from a company's perspective, why spend much more when something much cheaper accomplishes the same objective? If you can generate 50 images by noon, why would you commission just one and wait a week and also pay much more? Creatives often respond, but the human version is just better. But what if good enough really is good enough? There's a problem though. The company isn't the only one deciding what is good enough. The audience gets a vote too. And we are entering a strange period where people are becoming increasingly aware of synthetic content. You see an advertisement and something feels strange. You read an article or a newsletter and you just recognize this very particular style of writing. You hear a synthetic voice, you see a weirdly perfect person, and suddenly you're no longer paying attention to what the company wanted to communicate. You are paying attention to how it was made. And that can actually create a little crack in the communication. Because once I become suspicious about the content, I might start looking at the product and the message differently too. Are these research results genuine? Are these customer experiences real? How much has been verified? And suddenly it isn't really an illustration problem anymore, it's a trust problem. A lot of criticism of AI imagery has focused on quality. Like the hands were wrong, the physics didn't make sense, the shadows were off. But those things have already improved a lot, and they are going to continue improving. So I don't think building your careers around the idea that AI always produces bad work is a really good strategy. I think the more interesting question is what happens when AI-generated content looks excellent, but the audiences still don't like the feeling that something has been presented to them as more authentic than it really is. Those are two completely different problems. One is a quality problem and the other is a credibility problem. And credibility is much harder to fix. I have started thinking of this like an AI credibility tax. Not because every use of AI destroys trust, obviously it doesn't, but because certain uses of AI can introduce doubt where there wasn't any before. Imagine a brand uses an obviously generated person holding its product. Maybe you don't care, but maybe the product looks slightly too perfect. Now you're wondering whether it really looks like that, and suddenly the company has created a problem it didn't have before. The content was supposed to make the product easier to sell. Instead, it has made the customer slightly more skeptical. And this is where I find the whole thing slightly ironic. Companies spend enormous amounts of money building trust. Modern brands constantly tell us, we care, we're authentic, here's our story, meet our team, we understand you. They want personality, they want emotional connections, they want customers and clients to believe there are real people behind the business and real people consuming the products. And then some of those same companies look at the people creating their communication and ask, how many of these humans can we remove? There's a contradiction here. We are entering an era where companies desperately want to appear human while simultaneously automating the human responsible for creating that appearance. Imagine a company saves $5,000 using AI. Then the campaign launches, or the article, or the book, or whatever it is. Maybe people notice and the comments become about AI rather than the product. Maybe the brand suddenly looks cheaper than it intended to. Maybe the campaign gets mocked, maybe it has to be replaced, or maybe nothing dramatic happens at all, but the communication simply feels more generic and a little less trustworthy. How much did that $5,000 savings now cost? That's difficult to measure, but difficult to measure doesn't mean it's non-existent. And I'm not arguing this happens every time somebody uses AI. It clearly doesn't. There will be an enormous amount of AI-generated content people never notice, and plenty they will notice, but simply don't care about. My point is that trust needs to be a part of the calculation. Cheap isn't cheap if it communicates the wrong thing, and cheap isn't cheap if it damages how people perceive you. And I think this becomes even more interesting when we move away from advertising. Because it isn't only companies making these decisions, it's writers, researchers, publishers, experts, independent creators. So let's say you're an expert who has spent years researching, writing an article. You've developed an argument, you've checked your sources, you've put your name on it, and then you fill that article with obviously generated images because they took 30 seconds to create. What does that communicate about the article itself? Not necessarily what is true about the article. The reader doesn't know how much effort went into your research. They only see the final presentation. And if one part feels mass-produced and automated, it can affect how the rest of the work feels too. And especially with illustrations and imagery, which you tend to see first. That's especially interesting to me because I work in medical illustration. I actually don't want to make the argument that AI can't produce accurate medical illustrations because I think it probably will. It's improving incredibly quickly, and building our careers around the assumption that AI will always get anatomy wrong seems like a terrible strategy. For me, the most interesting question is, what does the use of AI communicate about the information surrounding the image? Imagine you're reading a scientific paper. The researchers may have spent years working on it. Their institutions are attached to it. Their professional reputations are attached to it. And then you encounter a graphic that looks obviously AI generated. Even if that graphic is technically correct, it might change your perception of the whole piece of work. And depending on the context, that doubt can extend beyond the image, because trust is partly perception. The same applies to a medical textbook, a patient information website, a pharmaceutical company, a hospital, a healthcare startup. If you're telling people we are careful, we are great at what we do, we are evidence-based, you can trust us, then the way you communicate those values really matters. And this is particularly relevant to medical illustration, because an illustration isn't decoration sitting next to the important information, it is part of the information. If you're publishing research that took 5 years to produce, why would you want the visual communication around that research to feel like it took 5 seconds? And this principle isn't new. Bad typography can make something look amateur. Bad photography can make a premium product look cheap. Poor packaging can change how we perceive what's inside. We do judge books by their cover. And AI just adds another layer, because synthetic content can carry association of being cheap, fast, automated, mass-produced, or low effort and low quality. That doesn't mean AI images equal bad information. It just means the presentation influences how we judge the information. For a consumer brand, that can be a branding problem. For a writer, it can affect the perceived authorship. And in science and medicine, it can become a credibility problem. And I think this is something creatives sometimes forget when we talk about clients. We tend to frame the question, why should they pay me when AI can make the image? But the client isn't only buying an image. They are buying something they are willing to put their name next to it. If I create an illustration for a surgeon or a researcher, their professional reputation sits beside that image. If I create something for a publisher, their name is on it. If I create the communication for a healthcare company, they are presenting it to patients, doctors, or customers as something that represents them. So the question isn't simply, can AI make this image? Of course it can. But the better question is, what does this image need to communicate about the person or organization publishing it? Care, expertise, authority, scientific rigor, trust. And once you look at it that way, the image itself is only part of what the client is buying. An example of this for myself, actually, not regarding medical illustration, is my friend with whom since the beginning of the year I'm producing nail stamping plates. I illustrate them and she markets them to her audience. So her audience actually despises AI illustration. And in the past, in that community, AI designed nail plates were shunned and not accepted. So for her, a really important marketing strategy is that she can tell them it's me, the real human illustrator Lucille, that illustrates these plates. They can look up my Instagram, my website, and they can see I'm a real human and I'm not using AI. So that is a really important and interesting conclusion. So what can we actually do? First, stop competing purely on output. If somebody wants 100 generic images by next week for almost no money, you probably can't and shouldn't win that competition with AI. Look for places where expertise, originality, accountability, or trust matters. Second, I'd make your expertise visible. Don't only show the finished image. Show some of the research, the sketches, the decisions, and the revisions behind it. Not because everybody needs to become an influencer and a content creator, but because you're demonstrating that there is thinking behind the image. Third, move upstream. Don't only be the person waiting to hear "draw this." Become the person who can say, I understand what you're trying to communicate, and here's how I think we should solve it. And number 4, think about whose reputation your work supports. For a company, that might be a brand. For a publisher, it might be the publication. And for a researcher, it might be their scientific credibility. For a writer, it might simply be their name. So for us as illustrators and designers, our work doesn't exist in isolation. It becomes part of the client's work and how they are perceived. And I think this is just a really important point to make to them and to remind them of. So in conclusion, Clients and companies aren't patrons of illustration, and building our future around hoping businesses preserve our craft because they love it as much as we do probably isn't going to work. But clients and companies do care about outcomes. They care about differentiation, they care about reputation, and they absolutely care about whether customers trust them. And perhaps that's where the opportunity actually is. So no competing with machines to produce more, faster, cheaper, but becoming the person whose judgment, expertise, and accountability makes the work worth trusting. Because cheap isn't cheap if it costs you trust.